Hare Krishna, Manoj. Prabhu, if you are ready, you can start the reading.
Yes, Mother, I'm ready.
Mm, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. All glory to Shri Prabhupada and Garangan. Thank you all for listening in this morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Prabhu.
Okay, Mataji, I'm going to start. Under Prabhupada's personal direction, the Los Angeles Center became a model for the rest of ISKCON. At the morning Bhagavatam class, for example, he had the devotees responsibly chant the Sanskrit mantras after him, and he asked that this become the standard program in all his temples. In May 1970, he wrote to each of his 26 temple presidents throughout North America and Europe, inviting them to visit him at Los Angeles. Prabhupada recites, "Now at the present moment, I am concentrating my energy in this Los Angeles center as ideal for all other centers in respect of deity worship, arti, kirtan, and other necessary paraphernalia. As I have curtailed my moving program, I wish that you may come here at your convenience and stay here for a few days and see personally how things are going on. And by meeting with me personally for necessary instruction, I hope simultaneously in all centers the activities will be of the same standard." The temple presidents who visited Prabhupada, most of them young men in their 20s, came with practical as well as philosophical questions. They came with their notebooks, writing down everything from the temple schedule to color schemes, noting the tunes used in the kirtans, learning how to manage a Sankirtan party, and perhaps most important of all, they would note the things Prabhupada did and the words he spoke personally to them. The temple presidents would then return to their own centers in Berkeley or Hamburg or Toronto or Sydney, glowing with ecstasy and ready to implement dozens of new standards they had imbibed from Prabhupada at the Los Angeles World Headquarters. Although Prabhupada still spoke of expanding his movement more and more, he seemed content to stay in Los Angeles, reaching the rest of the world through his temple presidents, his Sankirtan parties, and his books. New plans were unfolding, however, and Prabhupada again spoke of a governing body, 12 hand-picked disciples to manage all of ISKCON's affairs. He also spoke of initiating more sannyasis and taking them with him to India to train as itinerant preachers, and to ensure that his books were regularly and properly printed. He wanted to form a special committee in charge of book distribution and publication, sometimes managing his worldwide religious movement, sometimes leading them, the growing group of devotees in chanting Sanskrit mantras in the Los Angeles temple, and sometimes sitting alone and translating in the pre dawn hours. Prabhupada lived happily in Los Angeles. One day, a record arrived from London. The London devotees, who with George Harrison's help had already produced an album, had now also released a new single, Govinda. The song consisted of verses Prabhupada had taught them from Brahma Samhita, each verse ending with the refrain, Govindam Adi Purusham Tam Aham Bhajami. Prabhupada asked that the record be played during the morning program in the temple. The next morning, after he entered the temple room, bowed down before the deity, and taken his seat on the Vyasan to begin the class, the record began. Suddenly, Prabhupada became stunned with ecstasy. His body shivered, and tears streamed from his eyes. The devotees, feeling a glimmer of their spiritual master's emotion, began to chant Hare Krishna as if chanting Japa. The moments seemed to pass slowly. Finally, Prabhupada spoke. Govindam Adi Purusham Tamaham Bachami. He was again silent. Then he asked, "Is everyone all right?" The response was a huge roar, "Jai Prabhupada," and he began the Srimad Bhagavatam class. Vaishnavaya Kriya Mudra Vishnena Bhujaya. No one can understand the mind of a Vaishnav. Only a pure devotee can understand another pure devotee perfectly. But by observing the main activities of Prabhupada's life, we can see that whatever he did was pure service to Lord Krishna and was a perfect example of how to surrender to Krishna. He taught by precept and by example, often encouraging, even praising his disciples. He always pushed them into more and more participation in blissful Sankirtan movement of Lord Chaitanya. But he also exposed the faults of his disciples. And these faults were sometimes great and painful to see, both for him and for his disciples. One day, Prabhupada came into his quarters at the Los Angeles temple. He saw that one of his devotees cleaning his room had placed his picture upside down. A simple mistake, but it indicated something wrong in the disciples' mentality. Every morning, the devotees sing prayers to the spiritual master, honoring them as a direct representative of God. How could any sincere disciple not notice that he is standing God's representative upside down? Then a more serious discrepancy. Prabhupada went to the temple, greeted the deities, and went to take Janamrit, the scented water from the bathing of the deities. It was part of his daily schedule. After his morning walk, he would return to the temple and offer obeisances to the deities while the Govinda record was being played. A devotee would then offer him a few drops of Janamrit in his right palm and he would sip it. He had mentioned this item of devotional service in the Nectar of Devotion. Scented with perfumes and flowers, the water came gliding down through his lotus feet and is collected and mixed with yogurt. In this way, this Janamrit not only becomes very tastefully flavored, but also has tremendous spiritual value. The devotees who came to visit and offer respects to the deity take 3 drops of Charnamrit very submissively and feel themselves happy in transcendental bliss. On this particular morning, however, as Srila Prabhupada took Charnamrit, he frowned. Someone had put salt in it. He walked the length of the temple room, took his seat on the Vyasasana, and before a room full of 100 devotees asked, "Who put salt in the Charnamrit?" A younger girl in a sari stood and with a nervous smile said she had done it. "Why have you done it?" Prabhupada asked gravely. "I don't know," she giggled. Prabhupada turned to Gargamuni. "Get someone responsible." Everyone present felt Prabhupada's anger. The unpleasant moment marred the pure temple atmosphere. The disciple worships Krishna by pleasing Krishna's representative, the spiritual master. Therefore, to displease the spiritual master was a spiritual disqualification. The spiritual master was not merely a principle, he was a person, Srila Prabhupada. When ISKCON Press in Boston misprinted Prabhupada's name on a new book, he became deeply disturbed. The small paperback chapter from the second canto of Srimad Bhagavatam bore his name on the cover as simply A.C. Bhaktivedanta. Omitted was the customary His Divine Grace, as well as Swami Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada's name stood almost divested of spiritual significance. Another ISKCON Press publication described Prabhupada as Acharya of ISKCON, although Prabhupada had repeatedly emphasized that he was the founder Acharya. There had been many Acharyas or spiritual masters, and there would be many more. But His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada was the sole founder Acharya of International Society for Krishna Consciousness. To make matters worse, when Prabhupada first opened the new Bhagavatam chapter, the binding cracked and the pages fell out. Prabhupada glowered. The devotees in Boston, hearing of Prabhupada's anger, knew at once that their mistake in misprinting Srila Prabhupada's name was a serious oversight. Minimizing the spiritual master's position was a grave offense, and they had even published the offense. The serious implications were difficult for the devotees to face, and they knew that they would have to rectify their mentality before they could make spiritual progress. Prabhupada criticized the mentality behind these mistakes, and his criticisms were instructive to his disciples. Unless he instructed them about the absolute position of their spiritual master, how would they learn? At the beginning of the Srimad Bhagavatam class one morning, Prabhupada called on one of the women devotees, Nandarani. She stood respectfully. Do you chant 16 rounds every day? Well, I try, Prabhupada. This is the problem, Prabhupada said, turning to the temple president. If Nandarani, one of the senior responsible women, wasn't chanting regularly, then certainly the new women under her weren't either. This was the manager's fault. Prabhupada had praised and encouraged his disciples for laboring hard to renovate the temple and for going out daily into the streets to chant and distribute magazines. But for a devotee to not chant the prescribed rounds was to neglect the most important instruction. When Nandarani hadn't said, what Nandarani hadn't said was that the temple authorities had told her that chanting all her 16 rounds wasn't necessary as long as she worked. They had told her this even though Prabhupada clearly instructed his disciples at initiation to always chant at least 16 rounds daily. Then another incident. During the morning class, Prabhupada was discussing Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, an associate of Lord Chaitanya. Looking among the devotees, he asked, who can tell me who is Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya? No one spoke. Prabhupada waited. None of you can tell me who is Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, he asked. One girl raised her hand. She said, read something about him, that was all. Aren't you ashamed? Prabhupada looked at the men. You should be the leaders. If the men cannot advance, then the women cannot advance. You must be Brahmins. Then your wife will be Brahmins. But if you are not Brahmins, then what can they do? Without improving their chanting and without reading Krishna conscious literature, Prabhupada said, they would never attain the purity necessary for preaching Lord Chaitanya's message. While the local anomalies were weighing heavily on Srila Prabhupada, he learned of strange things his disciples in India had written in their letters, and he became more disturbed. One letter to devotees in America reported that Prabhupada's godbrothers in India objected to his title Prabhupada. According to them, only Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati should be called Prabhupada, and they referred to Prabhupada as Swami Maharaj. Prabhupada also learned that some of his disciples were saying he was not the only spiritual master. They were interested in reading Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's books, as if to discover some new teaching Prabhupada had not yet revealed. Prabhupada regarded these remarks as dangerous for ISKCON. Advancement in spiritual life was based on implicit faith in the spiritual master. And to Prabhupada, These new ideas indicated a relative conception, as opposed to the absolute conception of the spiritual master. Such a conception could destroy all he had established. At least it could destroy the spiritual life of anyone who held it. Though sometimes ignorant, his disciples, he knew, were not malicious. Yet, these letters from India carried a spiritual disease transmitted by several of Srila Prabhupada's god brothers to his disciples there. Prabhupada had already been troubled when some of his god brothers had refused to help him secure land in Mayapur, the birthplace of Lord Chaitanya. Although he had asked them to help his inexperienced disciples purchase land, they had not complied. In fact, some of them had worked against him. Prabhupada had written to one of his god brothers, I am so sorry to learn that there is a sort of conspiracy by some of our god brothers as not to give me a place at Mayapur. Prabhupada was sensitive to any threat to ISKCON. His accepting the name Prabhupada, his teaching that the disciples must approach the spiritual master as a direct could only be the workings of Maya, the Lord's illusionary energy. Maya was attempting to bewilder the devotees of ISKCON. That was her job, to lead the conditioned souls away from Krishna's service. The recent events began to hamper Prabhupada's writing. He had been working quickly in Los Angeles and had recently finished the second and final volume of Krishna. And on the tape on which he had dictated the last chapter of Krishna, he had immediately begun a summary of the 11th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. Gradually, however, his writing stopped. Karandhar speaks. Prabhupada's translating would require a great deal of concentration. He would have two or three of his big Bhagavatam volumes opened up, and sometimes a number of other small books, which he would refer to for something or other. He would sit, wearing his glasses and speaking into his dictating machine, and he would be completely absorbed in reading. Sometimes he would make a brief note, then look into one of his books, then open another book, turn back to another page, make a note, and then dictate. It required a great deal of concentration. I think that's why Prabhupada did most of it at night after he would rise from his late evening nap. From 1 or 2 in the morning until 6 or 7 in the morning, he would be absorbed. It was quiet at that time, and he could be absorbed. But when Prabhupada became disturbed about the problems in ISKCON, it inhibited his work. He was spending his time discussing with visiting devotees or myself or whoever was there. Then he would spend more time thinking matters over or pondering the problems, and he wouldn't be able to concentrate on his translating. These difficulties disturbed him, and he would think about them and say, I've not been able to concentrate. I've been thinking about this problem. Although the spiritual master suffers for his disciples' mistakes, Prabhupada's perspective was not simply negative. He continued chanting and lecturing in the temple and inviting the leaders of his movement to visit him in the ideal center of Los Angeles. But he also corrected the disease mentality wherever it appeared. When, for example, Guru Das wrote from London to say that they had allowed an Indian guest to lecture in the temple while sitting on Prabhupada's Vyasasan, Prabhupada immediately wrote back correcting him. I am surprised, Prabhupada speaks. I am surprised how you allowed Mr. Parekh to sit on the Vyasasana. You know that Vyasasana is meant for the representative of Vyasadev, the spiritual master. But Mr. Parekh does not come in the parampara to become the representative of Vyas. Neither does he have any sound knowledge of Vaishnav principles. I understand from your letter that sometimes discussions on Aurobindo philosophy are done by Mr. Parekh from the Vyasasana. So I'm a little surprised. How did you allow like this? I think you should rectify immediately all these mistakes as stated by you in the last two lines of your letter. I think the best thing to do is to stop his class. Nonsense ought not to be tolerated. In a letter from Paris, Tamal Krishna asked Prabhupada philosophical questions about the perfection of the spiritual master, and Prabhupada answered fully but sternly. A spiritual master is always liberated. In any condition of his life, he should not be mistaken as an ordinary human being. This position of the spiritual master is achieved by three processes. One is called sadhan siddha. That means one who is liberated by executing the regulative principles of devotional service. Another is called kripa siddha, one who is liberated by the mercy of Krishna or his devotee. And another is nitya siddha, who is never forgetful of Krishna throughout his whole life. These are the three features of the perfection of life. So far, Narad Muni is concerned in his previous life, he was a maidservant's son. But by the mercy of the devotees, he later on became Sita, and next life he appeared as Narada, with complete freedom to move anywhere by the grace of the Lord. So, even though he was in his previous life a maidservant's son, there was no impediment in the achievement of his perfect spiritual life. Similarly, any living entity who is conditioned can achieve the perfectional stage of life by the above mentioned processes, and a vivid example is Narad Muni. So I do not know why you have asked about my previous life, whether I was subjected to the laws of material nature. So even though accepting that I was subjected to the laws of material nature, does it hamper in my becoming spiritual master? What is your opinion? From the life of Narad Muni, it is distinct that although he was a conditioned soul in his previous life, there was no impediment of his becoming the spiritual master. This law is applicable not only to the spiritual master but to every living entity. So far I am concerned, I cannot say what I was in my previous life. But one great astrologer calculated that I was previously a physician, and my life was sinless. Besides that, to corroborate the statement of Bhagavad Gita, Suchinam Shrimatam Gehe Yoga Bhrashta Vichayate, which means an unfinished yogi takes birth in rich family or born of a suchi or pious father. By the grace of Krishna, I got those two opportunities in the present life to be born of a pious father and brought up in one of the richest aristocratic families of Calcutta, Kashinath Malik. The Radha Krishna Didi in this family called me to meet him, and therefore, last time when I was in Calcutta, I stayed in that temple along with my American disciples. Although I have immense opportunities to indulge in the four principles of the sinful life, Because I was connected with the very aristocratic family, Krishna always saved me. And throughout my life, I do not know what is illicit sex, intoxication, meat eating, or gambling. So far, my present life is concerned, I do not remember any part of my life when I was forgetful of Krishna. Prabhupada thought some of his leaders had become entangled in ISKCON management and were trying to gain control for themselves. In the classes, he would speak of this only indirectly, as he had when he had exposed that the devotees weren't chanting and reading enough. Consequently, most devotees were unaware of Prabhupada's anxiety. I'm going to read this paragraph one more time. Prabhupada thought some of his leaders had become entangled in ISKCON management and were trying to gain control for themselves. In the classes, he would speak of this only indirectly, as he had when he had exposed that the devotees weren't chanting and reading enough. Consequently, most devotees were unaware of Prabhupada's anxiety. But occasionally, while sitting in his room or in the garden, Prabhupada would express his concern. He wanted his disciples to manage ISKCON, but to do so, they must be pure. Only then would he be able to concentrate on writing books. In June, he wrote to Brahmananda. Prabhupada writes, "Now, my desire is that I completely devote my life in the matter of writing and translating. An arrangement should now be done that our society be managed automatically. I think we should have a central governing body for dealing with important matters. I have already talked with the Muni about this. So if you come back by the Rath Yatra festival, we can have a preliminary meeting at San Francisco in this connection." In July, Prabhupada visited San Francisco for the fourth annual ISKCON Rath Yatra. It was the biggest festival ever, with 10,000 people joining in the procession through Golden Gate Park to the beach. Prabhupada fell ill and didn't join the parade until about midway, just as he had done the year before, but some of his disciples restrained him. A gang of hoodlums, they said, had caused trouble earlier, and for Prabhupada to ride on the cart might be dangerous. He disagreed, but finally relented and rode in his car to the beach. At the Family Dog Auditorium on the beach, Prabhupada began his lecture. "I want to thank all of you for coming. Although I am not well, I felt it my responsibility to come, as you have come so kindly attended Lord Jagannath's Rath Yatra festival. I felt it is my duty to come and see you and address you." His voice was frail. Later in his apartment in San Francisco, Prabhupada complained that he had not been allowed to ride in the cart. As a leader of the Hare Krishna movement, he should have ridden on the cart. Not only had his disciples refused him, but several disciples had prominently ridden on the cart as if in his place. Prabhupada asked the many temple presidents assembled for the Rath Yatra to meet and discuss forming a governing body to manage ISKCON. The devotees met and then reported that they thought only one of them should be elected the chief representative. They hadn't understood. The strength should be in a group, Prabhupada said, not in a single individual. Since he was ISKCON's founder Acharya, what needed was there for another single leader? He asked them to meet again. Returning to his Los Angeles, Prabhupada announced he would award several of his disciples the sannyas order. The devotee community excitedly prepared for the festival. The sannyasis, Prabhupada said, would lead would leave their temples to travel and preach. It was an unprecedented change for ISKCON, a sensation, and the devotees loved it. Although Prabhupada was awarding sannyas to some of his most advanced disciples, he also said the sannyas initiation was to purify these disciples and to rid them of their entanglement in material desires. He set the initiation for the end of July, 2 weeks later. One day in Los Angeles, a visiting devotee speaking with Prabhupada in his room humbly asked why Prabhupada hadn't answered his questions in a recent letter. Prabhupada remembered no such letter. Inquiring from his secretary, Prabhupada discovered that his secretary often showed incoming letters to certain temple leaders who, at their discretion, would sometimes withhold letters they considered petty or too disturbing. Prabhupada was outraged. How dare they come between him and his other disciples? How could they presume to make such decisions on their own? How could a disciple censor his spiritual master's mail? Although Prabhupada reprimanded the devotees involved, the incident only increased the already heavy burden on his mind. Again, the thought of spiritual disease transmitted in letters from India disturbed him. He found no one close to him in Los Angeles with whom he could speak confidentially about the serious minimization of the spiritual master. As his anxiety affected him bodily, he fell ill and stopped eating. Karandhar speaks. I've heard some things, but in the spirit of going on, it had all been glossed over. And Prabhupada didn't talk much about it either. One time, though, I was in his room right after the sannyasis had left Los Angeles, and he asked me if I understood what had gone on. I said, well, I think so. But I didn't really know very much. At that time, the devotees who were going out on Sankirtan were in the alleyway chanting, and Prabhupada was at his desk. Hearing the kirtan, he turned back, looking in the direction of the devotees below his window, and smiled. And then he turned to me. They're innocent, he said. Do not involve them in this business. Karandhar still didn't understand, and he wondered what not to follow. He did know, however, that a shadow was hanging over the heads of the sannyasis. Prabhupada requested three trusted disciples to come be with him in Los Angeles. Rupanuga narrates, I was in Buffalo and the phone rang. Someone said, Srila Prabhupada is on the telephone. I said, what? You're kidding. It wasn't Srila Prabhupada, but it was his servant, Devananda. Devananda said, Srila Prabhupada wants you to come to Los Angeles. I said, what's wrong? He said, well, he doesn't want. Then he said, Srila Prabhupada wants to talk about it now. So Srila Prabhupada got on the phone, and as soon as I heard him on the line, I paid my obeisances. Then I said, Srila Prabhupada, what's wrong? He said, you didn't know I was in? I said, no. He said, you should come immediately. Then I said, uh, Srila Prabhupada, let me speak to Devananda. I was going on. So I asked Devananda, tell me what's going on. Then Devananda said, Srila Prabhupada said he will talk with when you come. He will explain everything. Bhagwan Das narrates, one day after coming home from Sankirtan, I received a call from Rupanuga, who told me he was on his way to Los Angeles, having received a call from Prabhupada that there was services there. He couldn't tell me more, but he said he would call me when he returned. This set my mind reeling. I sat in the chair, hot and sweaty after coming back from Sankirtan, my mind absorbed in thinking of Prabhupada and what could be going on. I called Los Angeles to talk to Prabhupada's secretary, Devananda, who told me he couldn't really say anything at that point. I was hoping somehow or other I would get more information of the situation. But after waiting some time, I went in to take a shower. I was in the shower when all of a sudden someone banged on the door. Prabhupada is on the phone. He wants to speak with you. I was sure there was some misunderstanding. How is it possible that the spiritual master could be on the telephone? Anyway, I ran out of the shower, all wet, and picked up the telephone and said, "Hello?" There was a long pause. Then all of a sudden, I heard Srila Prabhupada's voice on the other end. Bhagwan Das. Yes, I said. Srila Prabhupada, please accept my humble obeisances. How can I serve you? I was completely stunned. Then Prabhupada's voice came slowly on the phone. There are many things that you will do, but the first thing is that you must come here immediately. I said, of course, Srila Prabhupada, I will be there right away. And with that, we both hung up. I managed to gather the money together to take the flight to Los Angeles. And when I got on the plane in Detroit, it just so happened that Rupanuga was also on the same plane. We sat together and discussed what could be possibly be happening in Los Angeles. At the airport, Karandhar picked us up and told us that some of his older devotees has been plotting against Prabhupada, and that day Prabhupada had given several of the men sannyas and sent them away to preach. This was all quite amazing to me, and I didn't really know what to make of it. When we came into Prabhupada's room, he looked distressed and was rubbing his head, complaining of the blood pressure that was caused by the conspiracy. Tamal Krishna narrates, I had written Srila Prabhupada a lengthy letter from Paris describing how we wanted to expand our preaching effort in Europe. And suddenly I received a telegram from His Divine Grace that said, received your letter 26 July. Come, Los Angeles immediately. I was quite surprised, and I remember disentangled myself that very day and leaving that night. And even though I was in charge of the activities there, when I arrived in Los Angeles, I found Rupanuga, Bhagwan, Kirtananda Swami, and Karandhar. I was in a very enthusiastic, blissful mood from having done so much Sankirtan, and I had no idea of any difficulty. But these devotees were all in a very heavy, sober, somber mood, and they tried to explain to me what was going on. But actually, I could not get a very clear understanding. I had arrived in the late afternoon and I could not see Srila Prabhupada. Even the next morning, when Srila Prabhupada was informed that I had arrived, he called for me before Mangalarti. I went up to his quarters, and when I came through the door, Prabhupada was sitting in his room with his head downward. He looked up and he appeared to be almost ill. He was gaunt and looked very sorrowful. He said meekly, just as I was bowing down, have they told you? Of course, I hadn't really understood everything, but in reply to his question, I said, yes, they have told me some things. And Prabhupada said, can you help me? So I answered, yes, Srila Prabhupada. He said, can you take me out of here? I said, yes, Srila Prabhupada. Of course. I didn't feel that I could help Srila Prabhupada, but I could understand that I had to say yes. How can you say no? I won't. But how far could I help? It's like lifting the heaviest object in the world. The guru is so heavy, and yet I had to say yes. So Prabhupada asked me next, where will you take me? And I said, well, we can go to Florida. He said, no, that is not far enough. I said, I could take you to Europe. He said, no, that would also not be good. The problem may be there also. So, anyway, we didn't conclude where to go at that time, but Prabhupada said, it is like a fire here. I must leave it once. It has become like a fire. Prabhupada confided in Rupanuga, Tamal Krishna, and Bhagwan about the various incidents. His mail withheld, his name misprinted, his riding in the Rath Yatra parade restricted. He mentioned these and other indications that certain persons wanted to move him into the background out of the reach of his disciples. He didn't want to stay in Los Angeles. He didn't want to stay in the United States. He didn't even want to go to Europe. He wanted to leave the arena of his disciples' offenses, but before leaving, he wanted to complete his plans for establishing a governing body to manage ISKCON. To this end, he dictated the following on July 28th. Okay. Prabhupada narrates, I, the undersigned A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, disciple of Om Vishnupad Paramahansa, 108 Sri Srimad Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj Prabhupada, came in the United States in 1965 on September 18th for the purpose of starting Krishna consciousness movement. For 1 year, I had no shelter. I was traveling in many parts of the country. Then in 1966 July, I incorporated the society under the name and style of International Society for Krishna Consciousness, briefly ISKCON. Gradually, the society increased, and one after another, branches were opened. Now we have got 34 branches enlisted herewith. As we have increased our volume of activities, now I think a governing body commission, hereinafter referred to as the GBC, should be established. I'm getting older, 75 years old. Therefore, at any time, I may be out of the scene. Therefore, I think it is necessary to give instruction to my disciples how they shall manage the whole institution. They are already managing individual centers represented by one president, one secretary, and one treasurer. In my opinion, they're doing nice. But we want still more improvement in the standard of temple management, propaganda for Krishna consciousness, distribution of books and literatures, opening of new centers, and educating devotees to the right standard. Therefore, I have decided to adopt the following principles, and I hope my beloved disciples will kindly accept them. Prabhupada then listed the names of the 12 persons who would form the GBC. Shriman Rupanuga Das Adhikari, Shriman Bhagwan Das Adhikari, Shriman Shamsundar Das Adhikari, Shriman Sasavrup Das Adhikari, Shriman Karandhar Das Adhikari, Shriman Hansadatta Das Adhikari, Shriman Tamal Krishna Das Adhikari, Shriman Sudama Das Adhikari, Shriman Bali Mardan Das Brahmachari, Shriman Jagdish Das Adhikari, Shriman Hayagriv Das Adhikari, Shriman Krishna Das Adhikari. Okay, I'm going to quickly read this last page. These personalities are now considered as my direct representatives. While I'm living, they will act as my zonal secretaries, and after my demise, they will be known as executors. Prabhupada further described the role of the sannyasis. I have already awarded sannyas, or the renounced order of life, to some of my students, and they have also got very important duties to perform in this connection. The sannyasis will travel to our different centers for preaching purpose, as well as enlightening the members of the center for spiritual advancement. Prabhupada's legal document went on to set forth general directions for the GBC secretaries. They should travel regularly to the temples in their respective zones to ensure that each devotee chanted 16 rounds and followed a regulative schedule and that the temples were clean. His 12 GBC secretaries would relieve him of management and they would rectify present and future difficulties within the society. That rectification, Prabhupada's document explained, would be possible only when the devotees in each temple engaged fully in regulated devotional service, rising early for Mangalarti at 4:30, attending Srimad Bhagavatam class and reciting the Sanskrit verses and chanting in the streets and distributing back to Godhead magazines and other Krishna conscious literature. This emphasis on strictly following Krishna conscious principles would supersede all material formulas for management. The GBC would ensure that in their appointed zones, all the devotees were properly engaged. There would be no Maya. The next day, Prabhupada drafted another significant statement naming Bhagwan, Rupanuga, and Karandhar trustees of his Bhaktivedanta Book Trust. He narrates the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust account will be used to publish my books and literature and to establish temples throughout the world. Specifically, 3 temples are to be established, one in Mayapur, Vrindavan, and Jagannath Puri. Devotees, I'm going to stop here. Thank you all very, very much for giving us this opportunity to come together and read. And thank you for the taking time out of your busy morning to listen in. Thank you all very much. All goes to Shri Prabhupada. Gauranga. Hare Krishna.
Thank you so much, Manoj Prabhuji, for reading for all of us. It's a privilege for us. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, all devotees. We can meet tomorrow again. Vancha kalpatarubhyasya kripa sindhubhyev cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha ananta koti vaishnav vrinda ki jai Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mataji. I'm